All right. So once again, I will give our guest a bit of an intro before introducing him, and hopefully he doesn't blush too much. Our guest at this time is a distinguished Australian cultural historian, Professor of Australian Studies at Deakin University, and Fellow of the Academy of Social Sciences and the Australian Academy of Humanities. Has been a visiting professor at universities in the US, China, and Denmark, to name a few. His book, Not Dark Yet, A Personal History, is still a regularly downloaded title in the Vision Australia Library, despite being published back in 2011. Story tracing the Walker family over 5 generations from the settlement of his great-grandparents in South Australia in the 1850s until the death of his mother in the 1990s. Professor David Walker, thank you so much for taking the time to chat with us today.
It's my pleasure, Jordan. Thank you.
So, jumping straight in, for those who might not be aware, can you give us a bit of a description of what a cultural historian actually does?
Yeah, sure. I mean, it's more the history that sits away from politics. So it's not international relations. It's not political history or political science. It's more the kind of values and beliefs, practices that govern our day-to-day lives. So it's pretty much all the connecting tissue of our society, if you like, the things that we often take for granted. Um, and as a historian, I'd go to novels, to popular literature, to cartoons, and to that kind of source material to tease out the values that we live by, or aspire to live by, and sometimes fail to connect with.
So, getting a bit of knowledge, obviously, around your family. You had teaching in your blood. Had you always wanted to be a historian?
Pretty much so. I mean, I did have a slightly odd introduction to the life of the scholar because I was also conscripted for service in Vietnam. One thing I didn't have in my blood was a military career, I have to say, and I was permitted to complete my first degree and then go on to a subsequent degree while conscripted. And that proved to be a huge incentive to scholarship, I have to say, because I didn't support the war in Vietnam. I didn't think that I'd be a good addition to that conflict. Although Sir Robert Menzies obviously thought highly enough of me to want me to be there, but I thought no. And so at that point, I completed my degree at Adelaide and then discovered the longest degree known to humanity, which is the PhD, of course. So it was a circuitous path in it. So it wasn't a passion from the age of 4 years old to become a historian. It was a slightly winding path.
Yeah, yeah. And obviously going on to be a teacher and needing to sort of build those skills in that field, I imagine as well, because it's not something that comes natural to everybody. Did you kind of was there a particular teacher that you sort of used as a bit of a muse or to kind of build some of that sort of student teacher sort of dynamic that you probably built over the years?
Well, I went to Adelaide University and I had some pretty good teachers there in the history department. And although it was still quite formal, like in I was doing English literature, and we'd have tutorials. Had 8 or so people in a tutorial. Not only did the tutor call us by our surname, but we called each other by our surnames. So it was terribly kind of formal atmosphere, and I disliked that. So one of the things I learned was to try and dampen down that kind of formality, or to take away a lot of the kind of heavily professorial, you can't possibly understand this stuff atmosphere that surrounded some of the teaching that I got at Adelaide. So while I appreciated the content of it, the skill and knowledge, of many of my teachers. I didn't much like the terrible formality of a lot of it,
Yeah.
which kind of made us all nervous and apprehensive and scared about saying anything and scared about saying the wrong thing.
Yeah.
Which in any teaching environment, you've got to be able to say the wrong thing or something that is off centre, because none of us quite know what's right and what's wrong, and we feel our way towards it.
Yeah. And look, history is one of those topics, as well, where, as you said, the formality in that particular, there is often a look back to the past in order to educate the future. That's what history is technically all about. And some of that formalities kind of do cross over. Um, I've spoken to quite a few teachers in my time, and they often say the most difficult students make the best teachers. Would you agree with that statement?
Possibly, yeah, possibly, because I mean, I think it's important to be aware of what you don't know as much as it's important to be sure of what you do know,
Yeah,
because what you don't know is pretty vast when it all comes down to it. I mean, we only ever see a small bit of the world we inhabit, and we can only ever, even in the discipline that you've been in for a long time, you only see small parts of it,
yeah,
really. And to acknowledge that is not a bad idea, actually, because it does mean that you can call other people in to have their understanding of what the topic is unveiled, and you can proceed by discussion and feedback and toing and froing, and that's not a bad way to go, I think.
yeah, yeah. As you sort of mentioned, so you were conscripted to Vietnam. Obviously, you didn't believe in that war.
No,
I think there are some indicators there. As yourself as a cultural historian, you obviously travelled quite extensively. Can you explain what it is about this travel, especially in Asia, that kind of broadened your horizons and dispelled some of the stigmas often prevalent in Australian society at the time?
yeah. Well, I mean, in a sense, I grew up at a time when Asia was coming into more prominence for Australians, and actually going back, I'll go back a bit further, and I'll tell the story in Not Dark Yet. But one of my uncles was executed or beheaded actually on the island of Ambon in 1942 by the Japanese, and that story sort of sat in the family background. It was never really spoken of a whole lot, but I was aware growing up that something terrible and traumatic had happened. And I knew that Japan was somewhere involved in that. So, in a sense, growing up in the time that I did grow up, Asia was sort of there in a shadowy sort of way through that experience. And then increasingly through the 50s and 60s, White Australia policy, do we want, or who are these people we're excluding and why are we excluding them? What is it about them that we don't like, and so on. So growing up, all of those issues were sort of sitting in the background. Then the Vietnam thing came up. Like most of my generation, I knew almost nothing about Vietnam. I'd never studied Vietnam. It was never on any curriculum that I'd been exposed to. It wasn't a subject at the University of Adelaide, and yet here we were getting involved in that war. So Vietnam sort of played back into that discussion. And then later on, I had opportunities as an academic when I was at the University of New South Wales to go to Indonesia, where we had an Australian studies program. So I went back and forth to Indonesia quite a number of times, about 16 times, in fact. And then later on, China, Japan, and India came into the frame as well. And that was pretty important to me in a way because it was difficult to write about, as an Australian historian, it was difficult to write about how we understood the region without actually knowing something about the region. So in a way, the travel facilitated and enabled a discussion of where we sat as a nation in the Asia Pacific region.
And look, I would say quite a challenging conversation to be had at the time. Let's talk a little bit about what's often referred to as a bit of a landmark text, Anxious Nation, Australia and the Rise of Asia, 1850 to 1939. Obviously, your book. Did the book turn out as you conceptualized it?
Um, yes and no. I mean, you discover a book on the way through, and the way you
Yeah.
kind of discover it in writing. So as I got into it, I became aware of some subjects that had legs and would take me quite a long way, and others that were not quite so fruitful. So you learn on the way through what subject areas and what themes are important. I became interested, for example, in the invasion writing that was beginning in the 1890s and ran through quite strongly into the 1920s. And it goes beyond that. It's still going, in fact.
Yeah.
But I was interested in how that idea worked. You know, who were the invaders? Why were they invading? Uh, who would resist them in Australia, according to the fictional accounts of invasion? So again, getting back to the cultural history question, it became an exercise in discovering um, who were the supposedly virtuous people who could stand up to the threat the nation posed. Who were the people that might betray the nation or not act on its behalf
Yeah.
when you're called upon to do so? So it gave you a kind of list of characters that were nation building and nation forming characters, and all the logic, the cultural logic of those stories,
Yeah.
sort of interesting. So I got further into that sort of stuff than I'd originally anticipated, partly because I just became aware that there was a popular literature there that hadn't, none of the literary scholars had looked at it because it wasn't worth their while. You know, they didn't consider it great literature, but it was culturally informative.
Yeah. And this invasion narrative as well, even prominent in the sort of stimulus text when I was at school, tomorrow when the war began, sort of those sorts of things where this ideology of that our closest neighbor was going to be an invading force and that they would take Australia. How having been somebody who traveled around a lot and been welcomed by a lot of different cultures in Asia, did you find that difficult? Um, explaining to people that you were, you know, that you did you find that a little bit challenging? That I'm an Australian and there's this belief system that you're going to invade us?
Um, Not really. In a peculiar kind of way, I think they were receptive to the fact that a white Australian was prepared to talk about it. You know,
Yeah,
because for the most part, you know, people in Asia are aware that they're not necessarily or weren't necessarily highly regarded by white Australia. So to pretend that somehow that didn't exist was hardly convincing to people on the receiving end of that kind of prejudice.
yeah,
So if I was in Jakarta or Beijing or wherever and willing to talk about this stuff, they were interested in hearing someone in my position, uh, in a sense, unpack it, unravel it, explain it, because they wanted it explained themselves. So, you know, I've spent a lot of time in China. A lot of people in China and students in China are absolutely and totally baffled by the idea that they're going to invade us. You know, that they don't kind of see that as being at the top of any agenda that they've
yeah,
studied or been presented with. So what they need to know is how it came about that this idea took shape in Australia, and what were what was the cultural context and political circumstances that meant that we thought of the region in those ways. And you can offer explanations for that. I mean, one of the obvious explanations in 1900 is that there were 4 million white Australians and 400 million Chinese. So if you were interested in numbers, they're up there and we're down here. So uh, it looked plausible enough
Yeah.
that 400 million would want to occupy a continent that was only holding 4 million. So there are various arguments that you can run about explaining why it might have happened. But by and large, I mean, the people that I've talked to in the region have been pleased to have the opportunity for an open discussion about it without me being excessively defensive about it. You know, I'm just saying this is how it is, folks, and this is what the history tells us.
Yeah.
Let's have a look at it. You know, let's and they're interested in having a look at it as a kind of it's a cultural mechanism. It's a bit like it's a bit like a car. You know, you take it apart and work out how it operates. So cultural history is not dissimilar to that.
Yeah. Obviously the book received rather rave reviews. As I've already said, described as brave for the time. Earned an Ernest Scott Prize for History. Writing this book, I've spoken to a couple of authors in their time or in my time, and they often got to a certain point in the novel where they thought to themselves, actually, what I've got here is this is good. This is going to be something. Did you kind of anticipate that this would be a successful book like it was, or was it something that surprised you?
It didn't surprise me particularly because I thought the subject was substantial. You know, I thought Australia had a significant unease about its place in the region. I don't think that had been fully explored or teased out. So I felt pretty certain that there was a subject there, and that it was a story to be told. So I felt reasonably comfortable at that level. The reception of a book is always pretty hard to. I mean, you just don't know. You just don't know where it will land and who will respond to it favourably or not. But by and large, it did do pretty well critically. I didn't ever think of it as brave, actually. I mean, I thought it was, a job that I kind of had to do and wanted to do, and I lashed myself into doing it because always with authors there's a bit of an unease about whether you've got the stamina, whether you've got the staying power, are you going to make it happen, and so on. So they were the concerns rather more than notions of bravery, because it seemed to me a story that was well worth or a history that was well worth telling.
Yeah, definitely. Well, I mean, you must have thought definitely need to be discussed. There's a lot here to unpack.
Yeah, absolutely. Oh, the other thing that is very, very pleasing though is the 25th anniversary, or was, where are we? Last year maybe, and it did receive a kind of a review, a long review in one of the history journals, and I was very pleased about that because 25 years is a fairly long stretch,
Yeah.
and things can get forgotten in that time. So for it to be remembered and still discussed was extremely gratifying and very, very pleasing.
Yeah, and it stood the test of time as well.
More
It,
so than the author.
yeah. Not at all, mate. You look great. Can I ask a question? Because I saw a bit of a sort of educated, subtle sort of shake of the fist undercurrent to the book as well, with the social
uh,
view of the Awakening East at the time. It was very, very subtle though for a historian who'd obviously traveled around, must have had your own bias about how you've been welcomed to these places that are often viewed as, something than what they're not. And you've seen it firsthand that they're not what you thought they were or what other people thought they were. Am I correct in saying a very, very subtle sort of shake of the fist undercurrent?
oh, everything I do is very subtle, Jordan. You'd know that. No, not especially. I mean, my key motivation, I think, was to try and unravel the workings of the late colonial and early 20th century Australian mind. You know, that I was intrigued by that.
Yeah.
I didn't feel patronisingly towards it. I didn't feel that I was dealing with people who were inherently foolish.
No.
And I think that helped the book a lot, actually, because a lot of the commentary around Australia's Asian fears is rather disparaging, and it suggests that the people who hold those fears are necessarily a bit dim-witted and so on. But it didn't seem to me that that was a helpful starting point. That the best way to try and understand these anxieties was to dig into them and kind of work out what the gravitational pull was, what made them work, what made them seem logical, what sustained them, and what kept them going. And that seemed to be a more important motivation than anything else.
Yeah, and I suppose, even if you were too forceful in wanting to disprove any of these views on the time, once again, whether the text would continue to be enjoyed for many years to come, I yeah, if you used a bulldozer where a pen should have been, you
Yeah.
definitely might not have had the same uh acclaim over a lengthier period, I suppose, as well, which is what you're
I,
essentially aiming
I
for.
think that's probably right. I mean, I think the judgmental stuff does wear, it's very time specific. You know, the
Yeah.
judgments that we make, 25 years ago are not necessarily the ones we're making now. So it seemed it seemed to me increasingly, actually, as I get older and as I age as a historian, that the judgmental position is best abandoned. Really, that because the judgments do wear thin. They become very dated quite quickly, and that the judgment, the impulse to judge, can interfere with the impulse to understand. And I think that's kind of my resting point on that kind of discussion, I think.
Yeah, good call. We got a question here from Christy. Thank you for a great webinar. Thank you, Christy. Appreciate that. Um, when you were in Asia, did you learn any of the languages, especially Vietnamese?
That's an extremely cruel question, Christy. So I'll ask Jordan to pass on immediately. I attempted Bahasa, and I attempted Mandarin. I now have a Vietnamese. Well, he's an Australian son-in-law of Vietnamese parentage. I claim to be fluent in Mandarin, by the way, but I also then have to go on to explain that my fluency extends only to about 15 words, which are beautifully delivered. But Christy, no, I'm sorry. I'm that standard thing, essentially monolingual Australian male.
And look, there's a very famous international boxer who came to Australia who only knew three words, and they were yes, no, and how much. And he made a success for himself. So
Indeed. You
no
don't need a
one's
lot of vocabulary,
no one's going to batter
the
you.
right vocabulary.
So obviously, I guess following on from the book being quite a success, I'm assuming you agree with me that it was a success.
How
Uh,
could I just
you're welcomed as an esteemed guest amongst many educational institutions around Australia. Uh, getting asked to speak at a lot of these educational institutions as well, which can be. Was there nerves, or were you concerned about not meeting some of the blurbs sort of spoken as an intro to you? Like, was that quite a daunting experience for you?
in some ways it is. I mean, you don't, as when you're growing up, a lot of the vocabulary around like the word eminent, for example. I struggle with eminence a bit, but occasionally that's attached to me. I don't. I think you don't think of yourself in those terms particularly because there's a language around the position you hold and the way those positions are perceived by others, and the language you have for yourself, and the person you are yourself is still the person connected back to the 16-year-old who knew nothing, or the 20-year-old who made silly mistakes and so on. So you're still that kind of flawed, strange, inadequate creature that you always were. And then along come these big labels, and you think, my word, that's interesting.
So, fast forwarding to 2004, the way in which you viewed the world, both physically and figuratively, changed quite considerably. For
Yeah.
those unfamiliar with this story, can you give us a bit of a description regarding your sight loss?
Yes, I mean, it happened pretty suddenly. I mean, I was always quite short-sighted, but I accommodated that pretty well, I think. I hadn't been too bothered by that, but it was a predisposition for macular degeneration, which was what I achieved in 2004. And that happened very, very quickly in both eyes. I just lost lost sight. The center of the retina collapsed effectively. And I began the week kind of reading student essays and other stuff, and ended the week being unable to do so. So it was a very, very sudden collapse of sight, and I could almost feel it was as if the retina was a cliff face falling away. I could almost feel it falling away. It wasn't painful, but it was extremely disconcerting, and it was pretty hard at that stage to know because my whole professional life had been predicated on reading. That's effectively what I did. So the idea of not being able to read was really pretty difficult and pretty traumatizing. Initially, I couldn't send or receive emails. I can't do either of those things now, but I kind of worked at it, and I was able to get some of that vision, some of the peripheral vision back, because I still have peripheral vision. So, and you're unaware of it if you don't need it, but if you need it, you know how to use it. So I became increasingly dependent on peripheral vision and certain kinds of, technical uh, assistance. Backlighting on the computer was helpful. I couldn't read a book, but I could read the screen because of the backlighting on the screen and so on. But certainly for the first 6 months after that happened, I was in a fairly dark place, I think, and which led to the title of Not Dark Yet, which is the Bob Dylan song. It's not dark yet, but it's getting there, and that's pretty much what I felt was happening. I thought that I was getting there, but and I think I was also in some ways influenced by the kind of prejudices, if you like, that mainstream society have against people with a disability. I mean, a disability is, by definition, an incapacity to do something. So you're framed more by what you can't do than what you can do. So I think I brought that mentality into my own condition, if you like, and I was increasing or initially more impressed by what I couldn't do and how that would be regarded than by what I could continue to do. And that took a little bit of time to make that transition from being a person who couldn't do things to realizing that I was a person who could still do some things. Took a bit of time. That was maybe a 6 month rather dark time.
Yeah. Yeah. And look, we're gonna get on to not dark yet. Um, we're just at the halfway point of the webinar, so I will just remind people that we are definitely wanting your questions through. If you do have any questions and you are using a screen reader, the Zoom chat function is enabled. You can definitely send those questions through while we've got our guest here. Happy to answer them. For those who don't know how to do that, it is use keystroke Alt H to bring up the chat window, then type your question on in, and I will direct it to our guest. So look, as you explained, there was obviously a period where you were coming to terms with, a lot of people I speak to that they don't ever come to terms. There's one of those things where they have to continually, take it day by day. Um, how old were you when you lost your sight, David?
I was about 58.
At 58.
So
Okay.
that was a bit on the precocious side in a way because I still had I still I didn't think of myself as having come to the end of my professional career,
Yeah.
but it seemed to me that that would be becoming legally blind wasn't a good career move,
Yeah. Yeah.
and and that was in a sense the way it was treated by some of the people around me in the university environment. I mean, some people were good, and other people kind of thought, well, that's the end of him,
Right.
and um, and that that's and you can sometimes, again, I think with disability, I mean, people can feel guilty about their own disability. Oddly enough, I mean, you can feel complicit in the thing that's disabling you.
And whether you're inadvertently fueling that or anything like that, with
Yeah,
your
sure.
with you being a teacher, obviously, had you had sort of much interaction with people with disability in that time, or is it
Not a
something
huge
that,
amount. No, not a huge amount. I mean, and again, that's an interesting question, isn't it? Because I think most of us don't, in a way. I mean, most of us don't have a lot of interaction with people with a disability, and I've interacted more with them since becoming legally blind, obviously, and learned a lot in the process. Learned a lot about the fact that people with a disability can still do things.
yeah,
Um, and before that, I wouldn't have been. I don't think I would have been the ideal. While I criticised some of the people that I was around in the university environment, I'm not for a moment saying I reckon I would have been a whole lot better had it happened to someone else. I ponder that.
yeah.
I do wonder about that.
And look, a lot of the sort of things that people with a disability have brought to the world often go under the radar a little bit, or they don't they get put under this broad term of inspirational, and
Oh yes, yeah,
you do get a lot of that. And there are some things that people with disability create that are inspiring, that
yeah.
are spectacular. It's not what I'm saying, but they probably don't all belong in the same category. A good example, I spoke to a gentleman by the name of Sanford Greenberg, who ended up in the university setting. He actually ended up the roommate of Art Garfunkel over in and people remember that. They remember that, he was roommates with Art Garfunkel, but then don't recognize that he was involved with the technology that the Apollo 11 had on board when they
Right,
landed on the moon. So he
yeah,
often talks about that being going underneath the radar sort of thing.
indeed, yeah, yeah.
Um, Now that you have a bit of knowledge around lived experience and that sort of thing, have you found that you're kind of actively seeking out uh, people that you might be able to help on their educational path, or might even be able to sort of teach you some more stuff going forward as well?
Um, I'm certainly aware of and more aware of people who have difficulties of one kind or another. They needn't be sight related.
Yeah,
We bumped into a bit of autism in the family and so on. So I think I'm now more aware of just what these are divergent populations that we're talking about. So divergence needn't necessarily mean a negativity. It means it can be you don't actually know where to place a person. But in the scheme of things, that's not a bad. We need a bit of that in our societies. I think you need more people who are difficult to place in some ways, because people who are difficult to place will often come up with a different understanding,
Yeah.
or a creative way of looking at the world that's helpful rather than otherwise. So it's again a question of how you move from a deficit model of disability to something that's more enabling,
Yeah.
um, which can show you that the good things can still happen, and worthwhile things can happen.
And from your own standpoint, a lot of people that have gone through sight loss will often talk about needing to find their newfound purpose. And it sounds like you did a bit of that as well, but you actually went back to writing, which is something that you'd done previously. What was your thinking behind that?
Well, the thinking behind that was really that I wanted, because writing had been a fairly important part of who I was in a way. I mean, it was part of that, whatever identity is. I mean, that was part of who I was, and that was part of the identity I had. So to lose that was really quite concerning. It worried me that I couldn't any longer do that. So the not dark yet thing, I persuaded myself that I couldn't go into an archive in the way that a historian would normally go into an archive, boxes of files and all the rest of it, and kind of read my way through it. But we all carry between our ears our own archive, which is all the memories that we have of our parents and how they behaved, how they spoke, their how they dressed themselves, how they conducted themselves, and these are great sort of cultural signifiers, if you like. You can work out a lot about how people situate themselves in a society and in a culture by all those mannerisms, behaviours, and practices. So that's what led me back to writing through Not Dark Yet, to try and work out who this Walker family was, a family of small business people and teachers, and a middle class family. Often middle class families are not looked upon with great, or there's a feeling, there's nothing there to see much. They're
Yeah.
they're just being conventional and not doing much. But there's beneath those surfaces, there are often quite interesting lives being led, and decisions being made. And what are those decisions? How are those decisions made? Why this decision rather than that one? Why dress in this way rather than that way? Um, so, Not Dark Yet became an exercise in using the tools that I had as an historian around historical context and what how people operate at particular times in particular periods of time, to bring that into the my understanding of who this family was and where they came from,
Yeah.
to try and lock them into that historical context and explain them, both from my own memory but also as an historian.
And look, you sort of spoke on having to find new skills as a historian or utilize skills that you hadn't used traditionally in your previous writing of books. So you really had to kind of change your methods of doing things, but then you kind of stayed with your family and being something that was personal to you. Do you, once again, did you feel like there was a story there, or did you have doubts? Did you have a bit of concern that this might be just for your benefit, or was there a thought process halfway through the book where you thought, actually, this is brilliant, this is really good?
I don't think I ever got to "this is brilliant, this is really good" point, Jordan. But
Okay.
The No, I certainly had doubts because the initial response would be, why would I imagine my parents to be of any interest to anyone? I mean, they're of interest to me, but why would that transcend any kind of family and personal connection I might have to them? But increasingly, as I got into it, actually the first thing I wrote and had published was about my mother, who was in some ways quite an eccentric sort of woman with odd ideas about sight, for example. I mean, she didn't allow us as children to wear glasses, even though we were quite short-sighted, which I think, in retrospect, was tremendously helpful to me because I adapted early on to not having much sight, or living in a blurry world. So I don't look upon it now with any bitterness whatsoever. I think it was maybe, if anything, helpful. But so I wrote that and sent it off to a journal, and they published it. And the editor said, "Well, have you got more?" And at that point, I realised that I did have more. And he also said, "You've got a book if you want to go on with it." So,
Mhm.
and I did want to go on with it. And that turned out well. I enjoyed that writing. I enjoyed getting into those subjects, and some of them were subjects completely without a record, without much record. Like the family owned a Vanguard motor car, which
Yeah.
they purchased in about 1951 or something, and no records about the Vanguard. But so I was free to go. Imagine all the childhood memories of travelling around South Australia and interstate in the Vanguard with my parents, and that was tremendously liberating in a way. I didn't have to look at records. I didn't have to go to the archives. I didn't have to, do any of that. I just kind of remembered what that car was, what the family in it was like, what being the youngest of three children in that vehicle was like, and so on. So that worked well, and I enjoyed doing it.
And was there because obviously essentially there's a bit of analysis that goes into historical works and historical texts. You're
Yeah.
analyzing people from your memories, people personal, people that have a connection with what, like when you get asked questions like, why do you reckon your mum didn't want you having glasses? You would have had to have analyzed that as a historian. How would you answer that?
Well, I'd answer that by saying that in the 1930s, there was a when she was going through Teachers College in South Australia, there was a great deal of concern about what was called racial fitness.
Right.
And there was a concern that urban populations were degenerating and that, they were less healthy and less robust than the populations who used to till the soil and all the rest of it. So there was that argument around the degenerative impacts of modernity, and particularly urban modernity, and that the white race, again using the language of the 1930s, there's a fear that the white race was deteriorating, the birth rate was declining, and so on and so on. My mother, I think, bought into a lot of those ideas, which were prevalent at the time. And there were, a lot of, she wasn't explicitly racist, but she was kind of implicitly um, captured by a lot of those ideas, I think. So for her to have three children actually who were short-sighted was a sign of racial degeneration, if you like, a term she wouldn't have used, but I feel pretty confident that that would have been the anxiety that sat behind her desire for us not to wear glasses, because glasses, again, at that time, if you're talking about the 1950s and 60s, glasses were a sign that you were a bit of a weakling, and there was something quite badly wrong with you. So her way of getting around that was to say you don't wear glasses. So that means you're okay. Um, so yeah, so unpacking my mother, if you like, working out what as a kind of trainee teacher she would have been exposed to in the educational environment of the 1930s.
Yeah.
And that's where the historian, as historian, I was taken there in a way that a family historian might not be, because a family historian might not necessarily go back to, the theories around racial fitness in the 1930s, but a historian is obliged to go there.
Yeah, definitely. And that's, as we've sort of talked about, the level-headedness that you need to, especially writing such a personal text as well. That would have been quite challenging. There's not everyone could do that. It's probably the nicest way to put it. It'd be
Well,
very,
yeah. I mean, it does go back to the judgment versus understanding question. And you could
yeah,
rush to make a judgment about, what a bunch of stupid ideas they were, and what a terrible thing it was to inflict upon your children. And at one level, I can see that because I think, it might have been better if we'd been handled differently in terms of our sight. But on the other hand, the judgment is foreshortening. It pushes you to a place too quickly before you get to an understanding of what the dynamic is there. And I think the understanding the dynamic is both more interesting and certainly more rewarding than making the judgment.
and look, writing often gets used as, well, a lot of people say writing is therapy. Um, as you said, writing may very well have started off with you just wanting to get back to doing something that you exceeded and enjoyed in the past. Um, how much of it was therapy for you at this particular point in time?
I'm not so sure about that therapy argument, actually. I mean, I think, writing can also be very isolating, and it can also be quite hard work. I mean, you've got to
Yeah,
stick at it. You've got to sit in front of that computer or dictate, as I now do, and that can be really quite demanding. But
yeah,
what I find actually is that it's also usefully engaging. That gives you some mental nutrition, if you like, and a mental exercise. And in the same way, of course, an athlete like me is always working out, Jordan, as you would appreciate.
always, always, yeah,
Yeah, yeah, you know that. But also you just need mental exercise, and you need things to think about and nut out and work out. And writing does that. Writing is a real intellectual challenge in that sense. That you've got to, does that sentence deliver what I wanted it to deliver? And if I take that word out and put this word in, will it work better? And so on. So there are all those decisions you have to make
yeah,
that keep the brain functioning. And we're also a family that the last chapter of Not Dark Yet is about my mother's Alzheimer's.
yeah,
So we're a family that's had more than a brush with Alzheimer's. So the idea of keeping the brain working is fairly important to me, because I've also just learned that my brother's been diagnosed with Alzheimer's. So that's a mother, a sister, a brother,
yeah.
and it's building into a pretty unattractive lineage, I have to say, with me next in line. So I've got to keep the brain going.
Yeah, of course, of course. And look, you already touched on a little bit regarding some of the tools of the trade that you would regularly utilize, writing or dictating. Um, is there any other sort of, for any listeners out listening on the call, that is considering a writing, is there any other tools that you would say, geez, I wish I knew about that?
Yeah.
This works perfectly. I can't live without that sort of thing.
Um, One of the things I'd say, it's not exactly in that territory, I think, but in writing Not Dark Yet, one of the things that became apparent is the more you push memory, the more memory will deliver.
Right.
So if you go in like the on the car, on the family car, the famous vehicle, I thought initially that I'd be writing a couple of paragraphs about that, but the more I got into it, the more I remembered about sitting in the back seat of the Vanguard and traveling here and there and so on, and the various stories that came up around the car, the various mishaps we had with it. So a lot of that, a lot of that work um, helps because it's all in there somewhere. You know, it's all. We don't lose any of it. We lose sight of it, I think, or we can't necessarily locate it. But all of that stuff's in there somewhere. And the more you use the memory, the more you work on memory, the more accessible that becomes. The more you get into that and find that, and the more it comes to you. So you go to it initially on bended knee, pleading for more, and after a while, it'll come back to you and say, "How about this? What do you reckon about this? What do you
Yeah,
think about this?"
yeah. Look, which brings us obviously provides a pretty amazing segue for your most recent book, Happy Together: Bridging the Australia-China Divide. What can you tell us about that book and how we can get our hands on it?
Now, Jordan, you used the word brilliant before. That is a brilliant book, Jordan, I have to say. Um, it's a Lee. It's a joint memoir. I became very good friends with a person called Lee Yao, Professor Lee Yao, who's the foremost translator of Australian writing into English. He's published over 40 translated Australian books, which is a massive undertaking over a period of over 40 years, beginning with Henry Lawson, going right up to Alexis Wright and others. So a huge achievement. And I got to know, my wife Karen and I got to know Lee Yao very well when I was the BHP chair of Australian Studies at Peking University. And he translated Not Dark Yet, by the way, into Chinese. So the book is around two parallel lives: my life growing up in Australia and his life growing up in China at pretty much the same time. He's 3 months younger than I am. So he grew up in Inner Mongolia and I grew up in South Australia. So it's a story of the two lives and the different fates that unfolded for each of us, given the different environments we lived in and the different world circumstances that we encountered. But there are also remarkable similarities. I mean, we're both the children of school teachers, so there are quite a few of those similarities there. Lee Yao is a more bookish fellow than I was. My mum would have led me out by the ear and told me to play in the backyard if I spent as much time with books as he spent. And I'd tell him off for that, of course. Um, but the book is also an attempt to draw together the points of historical connection between Australia and China, which I'm very interested in as a historian. So it weaves in that historical context with what I think is really quite a powerful and compelling story about his life, his upbringing, his experiences of the Cultural Revolution, his family's experiences of the Cultural Revolution, which were indeed very grim, and but also the ways in which, across all these differences, we still need to speak to each other, listen to each other, and try to understand each other. So it's a book about how, at a difficult time geopolitically, we might try to understand lives that are very different from our own. Um, it's published by Melbourne University Press, and I guess it can be found on their website. Um, if you buy more than 1,000 copies, I'm sure you get a discount.
And look, we are, yeah, look, we're working on getting that one over onto the Vision Australia Library as well. So that's
That
a
would be great. I would
little bit
be
of a
very
spoiler
pleased
alert
about
on
that.
that one.
I'd be pleased about that. No, that'd be great. No, it's a
So,
good read. It's a good read, Jordan. It's a good read.
it's a good, I
It's
have
got
no
very
doubt,
good. It's
no
good. No,
doubt.
it's been very well reviewed, not least by Alexis Wright, I might say, who's a very fine storyteller herself. So she was very complimentary about it.
Yeah, perfect. So we're coming to the last 5 minutes of the webinar. So, I'm putting a shout out in for your last questions. If people have questions, this is, the last opportunity I've got to put them to David. So definitely got those in. I've got a question here from Kathy. What is the difference between the two books? Is Not Dark Yet more about your adjustment to vision loss?
Yes, it is a bit, and it's more about the family history. So it goes back more into the family in the late 19th and early 20th century. It also comes up, as I say, to my mother's to Alzheimer's and the experience of living with someone facing that condition. So it's more about the family. I'm not in it a whole lot actually. I mean, I bob in occasionally, and take a bow or direct the traffic. But I'm more directly in Happy Together, although it's predominantly the weighting would be maybe 70% Lee, 30% me in Happy Together.
Brilliant. So obviously still writing at the present moment. What are we expecting in the next sort of 12 months from you, for you, or from yourself? Are you working on any projects at the moment that you'd like us to know about?
Yes, I am. I'm quite interested in the way the map of Australia. This is not such an easy one to explain in some ways, but the map of Australia is used not as in a strictly cartographic kind of way, but in an imaginative way by cartoonists and others. And there was a lot of that in the late 19th and early 20th century in particular. So I'm looking at the way those often slightly distorted or creative or imagined maps of the continent and who we are, what messages they're sending about who we are as a people and what we stand for. So that's kind of where I'm going at the moment. It's a brilliant choice of topic for someone who's legally blind to come up with something that's visually demanding, Jordan. So you can see the logic of it immediately.
Of course, of course, of course. And how far along are you in the project?
Well over halfway.
Okay, okay,
Mm,
cool.
mm,
Very
mm.
interested to hear about that. So I've also I've got a message here. Once again, this might be a really great way to end the webinar as well. So thank you for talking about your book. I'm actually thinking of suggesting it for the book club I host. So
Good idea. Yeah. No, it is. It has had a couple of book club recommendations, and it's gone over pretty well, I think. And it's certainly pretty current in terms of our relationship with China. Very much on the agenda with the Prime Minister's recent visit, of course, and just what do we do with a neighbour as large as China? I mean, how do we manage that relationship, and what should we think about it? And the book addresses those sort of questions, but it does it in a more in what I think is a more personally engaging sort of way, if you like.
yeah, yeah. Well, very much looking forward to getting my hands on that one. David, thank you so much for taking the time to chat to us today. It's been an absolute privilege. Your knowledge is second to none. So I would say that our listeners have got so much out of this today. So once again, big thank you to our guest, David, for taking the time to chat to us today.
It was my pleasure, Jordan, and thank you, and thank your guests. So I'm happy to do it.
Awesome. And please thank your helper as well that helped you set up
Very good.
on the
I wish
screen as well.
yes, without whom.
They're a lot there. She's a lot better a helper than my kids are, which I have to lock out of my workspace. So yeah, definitely worth a thank you. And we look forward to seeing your current project come to fruition as well.
Thank you, Jordan, and thank you again.
Amazing. All right, I'll end that webinar today. So thank you all for joining. Next week we'll be speaking to Aaron Vernon, who's a accessible game designer. So that will be a fantastic way to end this webinar series. But once again, thank you all for joining us, and I will see you guys next week.